Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. Uh, it's so great to be here with you and with our very special guest this evening, Mr. Pardeep Singh Nagra. So welcome. Thank you for spending your evening with us this Wednesday night in snowy November. This is a special presentation by the Museums of Mississauga, and we are, oops, sorry. I'm just getting my PowerPoint queued up. We've got a little bit of housekeeping to go through tonight, a couple items, and then we will share, well, Pardeep is going to share an incredible presentation with you. My name's Elizabeth. I'll be your host this evening, and I am joined by my colleague Megan Wiles from the Museums of Mississauga. And of course, our wonderful guest speaker, Pardeep Singh Nagra, the Executive Director of the Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada. And so appropriate. In just a few moments, Pardeep will discuss the celebrated military legacy of Sikh British subjects, their essential role in the First World War, and their fight for equality in Canada. And he's also going to bring in some interesting military facts related to the town in which he grew up, Malton, Mississauga. And he has a really cool little surprise for us that I know you're all going to love. So that's fantastic. Before we begin, I'd like to share and acknowledge the land on which we work and create. I acknowledge that this is the traditional territory and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and traditional homeland of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee First Nations. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and global Indigenous peoples who call this region home today. And we acknowledge all of the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. We know that these words only hold meaning if they are followed by thoughtful action and a commitment to listening and learning. And the land acknowledgement is from the city of Mississauga and surrounding area, in case you are joining us from outside of this region that we're referring to. So we do have a little bit of a housekeeping presentation here, and I am trying to zip away on my computer desktop to bring that up. We were just laughing earlier that, man, when we used to do live events, it was just like, you just grab what you need and you go and you put people here, and now it's, oh my goodness, technology. So thank you for bearing with me as I struggle through this. But hopefully this little presentation now will be helpful for you just to help orient you to this platform that you've joined us for, which is new for many, I'm sure, WebEx events. It's not Zoom, it's got a bit of a different format. So this is kind of what it will look like this evening for you. While Pardeep is showing his slides, you'll have the speakers. The default setting is that we'll be up here at the top of the screen. I'll show you in a moment how you can change that. As I mentioned earlier, there's also a Q&A box, so we do have you on mute, and it's not possible to unmute, but we do want to hear from you definitely. So please enter your question into this Q&A box here. And if you close the box, you can always reopen it again by clicking on this little Q&A icon down here in the bottom right-hand corner. It may look slightly different on your computer or your tablet or phone, depending on what you're using, but that's the general look of it. If there are any problems with audio, let's say you decide to switch over to headphones, for example, These three buttons will give you the option to change up your audio settings, switch them, and then you may have an icon that looks something like this, a small rectangle in a circle. And if you'd like to change your view of how this looks on your computers so that maybe you just have Pardeep speaking on your computer and you don't see Megan and I, you can do that by finding this icon here. Okay. Thank you for bearing with me as I go through all those details. Perfect. Okay, Megan, I think I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Sure, thank you. Hello, everybody. This talk is presented by the Museums of Mississauga in conjunction with War Flowers, an immersive multisensory exhibition that focuses on the stories of 10 Canadians in the First World War, on view now until December 13th at the Living Arts Centre. Pre-book tickets are available through the Living Arts Centre box office online. The talk also complements the exhibition Our Boys, on view at the Bradley Museum and Benares Historic House, that reflects on soldiers from Mississauga who lost their lives in the First World War. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. Pardeep Singh Nagra is a leading Canadian historian, researcher, and speaker specializing in Sikh pioneer and military history in Canada and the diaspora. He has curated exhibitions locally, nationally, and internationally, and enjoys collecting Sikh toy soldiers. In his spare time, Pardeep recently qualified for and ran the Boston Marathon. Wow. Welcome, Pardeep. Would you like to cue up your slideshow?
Absolutely. So first of all, I also want to acknowledge the Indigenous lands that I'm speaking on, and as well as recognize the Indigenous lands that a lot of our participants are from coast to coast across Canada, and those outside of Canada that are tuning in. And I'm looking forward to the presentation. For me, it's about storytelling. Stories are important. They form part of our lived and learned experiences. And when it comes to Sikhs in the World Wars, it's stories that must be told and shared, because if we're not telling them, then one of two things is going to happen. Either the stories are never going to be shared or told, or they're going to be told through someone else's lens. And so that's what brings me here tonight, to be able to share the story. And for some people, just to see the vast imagery and resources and connections that we as Canadians have with respect to not only Sikhs, but our participation in World War I and World War II. So quite excited to get started. And as mentioned, we're not going to be taking questions immediately. Do post your questions. We'll open up the Q&A piece itself, and you'll have an opportunity at the end. We will gather and see if some themes are emerging and be able to answer some of the questions. And if not, then my contact information is going to be on the very first slide itself. And so if there's something you need to specifically follow up with me, you can always contact me directly. So let's get started here. So it
So you should be able to share. I did pass it over.
Share. So is it being shared now?
Not quite yet.
Okay. So this is exactly what we're worried about in technology,
This
right?
is literally what we practiced like 5 times, and then it happened, and then it's like, what? Okay, it's okay. So do you have the bottom of the screen share content? Is it clicking for you?
Yeah, so we'll just try sharing the content again. Yeah, absolutely.
There we go. Beautiful.
Perfect. Great. As everybody's aware, we've titled the presentation today called Brothers in Arms, the Sikhs in World War I. Again, my name is Pardeep Singh Nagra. I'm the Executive Director of the Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada. My email contact information is there, pardeep@shmc.ca. And I just want to share that this presentation is in conjunction with the City of Mississauga, Indus Media Foundation, and the Government of Canada. So when we're looking at the war, and I'm probably just going to step back again to the first slide here, because it's a great imagery that we see on the magazine cover called The Great War Magazine. And you will see the Sikh soldiers marching down, and the Sikh soldier in the front actually has the Sikh scripture on top of his head there. And faith was always important to soldiers across many different faiths. We know that there were chaplains that were available there during the war, but sometimes we haven't been able to identify and see how other communities and their faith and how they're engaging their faith during the war. And so this was a scene in Mesopotamia. And we'll be getting into some more of the stories of the different theaters of war that the Sikhs participated in. But we can't just talk about the war without setting some kind of context of what was the reality around the world, and in fact, just here specifically in Canada. The image on the screen that we see here is a ship called the Komagata Maru. And it had approximately 376 passengers, predominantly Sikhs, Muslims, and Hindus from the Punjab region, who embarked on a journey to come and join their fellow countrymen as pioneers here to Canada in 1914. There was already a large established community happening across the West Coast here in Canada of Sikh pioneer settlement. And so this was a ship that was carrying would-be Canadians or people looking to become Canadians who were coming here to explore the vast opportunities that were presenting itself in 1914. The ship took 2 months to get here, and it arrived approximately May 23rd in 1914. And unfortunately, the passengers were not allowed to disembark, and the ship was left in the waters for 2 months until July 23rd, and the ship was returned. And technically, and you will hear these dates because they're really significant when we're just really looking at what's happening in the context of the war. It took another 2 months for the ship to go back, and so that we'll map that out to September, and I'll be speaking about that significant date itself. But really, so here's July 23rd, the ship gets sent back. These passengers we talked about at that context, who were they, right? They were British subjects. India was not partitioned and freed till 1947 as a country, and so it was under British rule. And so each one of these passengers were fellow British subjects. Their head of state was the Queen, just like we have today as Canadians. The head of state still the Queen. And so it was interesting that literally the war gets called in August. So a week before, these British subjects are turned away from a fellow Commonwealth country for which they had every right and access to be here. And in 2014, the Sikh Heritage Museum was involved in helping get the stamp released to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Komagata Maru incident. And the Komagata Maru was turned away based on order in council, a law that was created in 1908 called the Continuous Journey Legislation. And the primary premise behind it was to keep immigrants who are racialized out of Canada. Because at the same time that this ship was turned away, Canada was welcoming and encouraging European migrants and immigrants to come to Canada, was offering free land by the thousands and millions. And so part of the spirit of the continuous journey legislation was to keep Canada a white country. And that context is important because this is happening literally a week to a week and a half before the call of World War I comes out. And this was an article in the Literary Digest on July 18th, 1914. And it's interesting when you look at the title of the article, and it said, Sikhs Besieging Canada. And so there was this anxiety around anti-Asian migration into Canada, and that included South Asians, East Asians, right across the Asian diaspora. And this was how these British subjects were being labeled. And you know, as we're going to unfold the story of the war, it's two different worlds of what's happening here, literally a week before war gets called, and what ultimately happens in the theater of war, in the Great War. And so when we look at when these individuals on the ship were turned back, and this was a Maclean's article, a flashback article, and it said when Vancouver turned back the Sikhs, and it was not just when Vancouver turned back the Sikhs, but when Vancouver, Canada, Britain, the Crown, the Empire turned their backs to the Sikhs. And it's an important narrative because the war gets called, and very quickly within the four initial weeks of the war, the first 4 weeks of the war, England and its allies realized that they were losing the war. And so what happens? A call gets placed to the largest available army to the British, which was the British Indian Army. And this was an article that was in a magazine, and it has the message of King George, who was the princess of the people of India, and it's dated September 10th, 1914. And it says, among the many incidents that have marked the unanimous uprising of the population of my empire in defense of its unity and integrity, nothing has moved me more than the passionate devotion to my throne expressed by both my Indian subjects and by the feudatory princes and ruling chiefs of India, and the prodigal offers of their lives and the resources in the cause of the realm. Their once voiced demand to be foremost in the conflict has touched my heart and has inspired to the highest issues the love and devotion which, as I well know, have ever linked my Indian subjects and myself. And so, who is this call going out to? It's going out to the villages, the people who were just turned back on the shores of Canada. And we're needed. We're needed. And we answer the call. And we actually arrive in September, almost to the day a ship arrives in France in Marseille, that the Komagata Maru itself is docking back in Calcutta, and there's a shootout by British authorities on the passengers of the Komagata Maru at Budge Budge. And so you see the tales of these two ships. On the Vancouver Canadian side, we're seen as undesirables, not wanted, and yet family men, ancestors, villagers, all connected to these passengers, are going to become the saviors on the Western Front. Because it's interesting, we just passed Remembrance Day. And when we're thinking about the poppy, and as we're celebrating Remembrance Day as Canadians, we don't realize that Canada as a country entered the war in 1915. And here we are in September 1914, and people who look like me have already entered the war and are in fact waiting for my fellow Canadians to come and join them on the Western Front. And it's an important narrative because too often in our histories, and I'm going to be sharing that throughout the presentation, the erasure has a huge cost. And so what would it be, and how would the story be told to Canadians if we started our war story by saying, yeah, we entered and joined fellow Sikh soldiers in the war when we entered in 1915? It would be a different narrative. And so it's important to know even just the timing and the tale of this community, who at the exact same time in history is not wanted but greatly needed. And many stories have been written, and I'm going to be sharing some of them, that have said that if it wasn't for these brave soldiers who entered a war that did not belong to them, the war would have probably been over by December. And so the valor for which we entered the war and shifted at that point. Yes, the war ended up lasting a number of more years, but it shifted the whole momentum of the war. And I think those are important history pieces that we must understand. And so I wanted to put that context to understand that what was happening here in Canada amongst these same people who were now going to have this great service in the war. And so I probably want to spend just the next about 8-9 minutes just sharing some of our resources. And for people that have their family watching this presentation, for the young kids that are watching, it's really interesting because the number of slides I'm going to be sharing, the next set of slides, are all original postcards from World War I. And we at the museum have over 500 original World War I postcards. And it's interesting because you can pretty much go across the whole spectrum of the war in so many different aspects of it just through the postcards and the visuals of postcards. So we're going to have a little bit of fun. Don't mind my little various quotes as I'm engaging as part of the pictorials, but we're not going to spend a heavy amount of time. It's just want to give us some aesthetic flavor for us to start seeing some great original imagery and artifacts related to the war. So as I mentioned, and as you had seen in this pictorial on the right-hand side, that the Sikh soldiers were just disembarking off the ship, and they're pretty much walking over towards the train stations, because from the shipyards onto the trains, they're heading into different villages, including Marseille and stuff. And so here we have a postcard, all aboard, ready to continue on their journey to enter the theater of war. And it's really interesting because you can just start seeing the conditions, and you look at these soldiers that are quite excited, right? They're not looking like they're downtrodden or anything. They're quite excited to be in the war, check out a new country, and are quite excited at this moment because you can just tell by how inquisitive they are of their surroundings and their environments and where they're heading. I really like this postcard itself too. It's just a little peekaboo out of some soldiers peeking out of the trains. And it's interesting because, again, if we don't show these types of pictures, we think it's just about getting onto the train and moving on. But some of these train rides and weeks on the ship to get here, you can see the conditions for which they were still even just having to taking care of just what we call the basic necessities of day-to-day life, of just keeping sanitized and washing up. And as the title says, it's an open change room, right, that we take for granted here. And you can just see some of them here, just I guess having a little foot massage as part of their cleaning. And there's always time and room for some chai and tea. So you can see them with their again, just imagine how these soldiers have to think about what kind of resources they're going to have. They didn't know how long the war was going to take. They didn't know how long they were going to be there. We heard many stories that they weren't necessarily equipped for the winter that was coming. For some of them, it was going to be the first time seeing snow. But it was September, and for now, they can still enjoy some tea as they're moving along. And you know, it's just a great narrative as they're coming off the trains and walking through the towns to get to their campsites. And you can see the gentleman on the left-hand side giving a salute to the Sikh soldiers who are arriving to help support the war efforts. Another great piece, you can just see the crowds that have formed to receive these soldiers. And you know, it's interesting because we're going to be sharing some stories and we're looking about identity. You know, this is in France. And it's interesting because today, as we speak in 2020, individuals like myself who work for a school board as part of a government in public service, today in France, do not have the rights to have our articles of faith intact. And yet you will see throughout the war that the Sikh soldiers fought with nothing more than the turbans on their head. And so if we were able to fight for your country, defend your constitution, defend your land, and you can show up in crowds, then you should still be in crowds today to support the right for us to be able to live in France with the integrity of our articles of faith. But this is why history is so important. This is why narratives are so important, because how France and its people have forgot these people who they lined up for and were saluting and cheering and thanking. You can see the one of the people on the left-hand side there clapping. And so, you know, the question is not about the welcome there. The question is the welcome today as well. And fascinating in terms of just the diversity within the army, and that, you know, we had pipers, we had drummers, and these were all part of, whether you're part of the color guard or you're a bugler, and so there was not anything that was different of a Sikh soldier entering the war than his fellow soldiers from any other Commonwealth country, and the various ranks and the various different positions that they held. It's really interesting, this postcard, you see, again, when I was putting this context, the soldier in the front is holding the French flag. And the postcard, it says that in English, it says, "Gentlemen of India marching to chasten German hooligans." So it's interesting. But you know, there's a term within the Sikh community called Sant Sipai, and it's known as Saint Soldiers. And so here we are marching in to war, and you can just see the dignity for which the soldiers are even giving to knowing this country that they're looking to defend, and they're willing to be holding that French flag to saying, this is who we're here for, to defend this country. Again, this is where the Sikh community and many Sikh soldiers set up camp. And again, you can just see the awe of fellow villagers in France who were constantly gathering to see these soldiers coming in and setting up camp as they're heading off to war. And so you could just imagine the spectacle that was happening as inhabitants of France are seeing this large wave of the British Indian Army coming in. And, you know, there's, again, many stories of local French people sharing of how these dark-haired, tall, sturdy, handsome men were entering the war, and the communities were quite in awe of the Sikh soldiers. Again, just a zoomed-in image of some Sikhs at the camp. Hey, it's my first plug to hometown Malton, and if anybody knows, just off of Finch there's an Indian campground right on the border of Malton there. And so this is my first shout out to my hometown there in Mississauga. And again, just as I mentioned, just showing all the various different stages of the war. And what's also rare too, sometimes of the postcards, sometimes you see different language used on the postcards describing the soldiers as Indian, Hindu. And then there's some postcards that got the correct, what I call a geopolitical identification of the various soldiers. And there were Muslim soldiers, Hindu soldiers, soldiers from many different faith backgrounds. But that time, sometimes just grouping them as Indian soldiers, and Hindu was a term used not as a religious connotation, but rather from the soldiers from Hindustan. And just keep this image in mind, because we're going to be having a special presentation at the end showing a small video. And it's going to be really important when you're looking at uniforms and how the soldiers were marching and going up to the war. And again, I mentioned all the different aspects of the soldiers. And again, we were also heavily engaged as part of cavalry as well in the war as horsemen and cavalry regiments. One of my favorite pictures, and it says Sikhs advancing with machine guns on the battlefield. And again, when I was mentioning one of the first postcards we were showing of us on the trains, you can just still look that there's this glow that you see on two Sikh soldiers on the right-hand side. One of them is almost seeing the camera, taking a picture of him and giving a great smile. And so, quite excited to enter the war. And it was their spirit throughout the war. Again, many different articles speak to just the joy for which how the Sikhs engaged in the war, and that they were never seen being in any type of fear whatsoever. And what's interesting is that as part of the war comes casualties. Some start off as injuries itself. And one of the closest ports to France was Dover in England. And Dover is home to the Royal Brighton Pavilion. And so what they did was that they converted the Brighton Pavilion into what was known as the Indian Military Hospital. And so any number of the soldiers that were wounded in war were brought across and housed and cared for here. And it's interesting because there's a book called Dr. Brighton's Indian Soldiers, and it has letters from the soldiers, and they're writing back home, and sometimes they're writing and saying, "Don't worry, we're being well taken care of." And because remember, when you're looking at the race politics and British colonialism, it was British rule in India, and a racialized soldier would not think that a white person will be attending to them with such great care and dignity as they're receiving here in Brighton. And you just see, this is just one of the rooms here, and the big chandelier. And so here was this royal, literally palace, for which was converted into a military hospital for a number of years. And it's where a lot of them were getting attended to get back into health, to join the war effort. And again, just some pictures and postcards of the soldiers in the Brighton Pavilion. These are some of the convalescent Sikhs in Brighton. And I'm just going to shift out for a split second from the postcards on the next couple of slides here, because a little piece of history that many people within the Sikh community are not aware of was that the last great Sikh king, Maharaja Dalip Singh, who was the son of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, his daughter, Princess Sophia Dalip Singh, served in World War I as a nurse, and she actually visited the soldiers. And one of the soldiers wrote back saying that the granddaughter of the great King Maharaja Ranjit Singh visited us today, and it was a joyous day. And so I'm just going to be sharing some of the pictures because I think it's important, because another part of Princess Sophia Dalip Singh's story that people might not be aware of is that she was a world leading figure in the suffragette movement. And in fact, just a couple of years ago, England produced a stamp with her image on it to commemorate her work as a suffragette. And so it's important to know, and what you see here on the slide is an ivory mirror that she presented to the wounded soldiers who were recovering in Brighton. And you can faintly read it, and the text is on the right-hand side here, and it says, "From Her Highness Princess Sophia Dalip Singh, each wounded Sikh sepoy was given one by Her Highness." And it says Brighton, I think the year was approximately 1915 there. So back to postcards. And I think if you're just going to be reading the letters at the top, some of these images will then bring another set of reality to the war. We talked about casualties, and sometimes beyond a casualty, you might have been a POW. And so these last three images were of Sikh prisoners of war that were captured by the Germans. And at the end of the day, we all know that victory was ours as part of the Allied forces. And we get to share some imageries of Sikhs participating in the victory parades. And so what also happened was, as a thank you for the treatment that the wounded soldiers received in Brighton, the Maharaja of Patiala, which was one of the Sikh princely states during the war who provided resources, dedicated a special new entrance to the Brighton Pavilion. And so this was the dedication ceremony of the Indian Memorial there in Brighton after the war efforts, as a thank you for the treatment of the wounded Sikh soldiers in Brighton. So that part sums up kind of the flavor of the war, but postcards were also used not only to share what was happening in the war, but also for propaganda. And the next one I'm going to share is a really interesting one. It's a postcard, and it was published by Boots Chemist in England. And on the left-hand side, it says, "The glory of a lion is his mane." And it's actually a riddle. And I'm not sure how many of you who are looking at the screen have solved the riddle, but what it's trying to say is that the glory of the lion, who metaphorically on this postcard is the empire, is England, is his mane. And if you look at the lion's mane, you will actually see writing and text. The whole mane is actually letters. And it starts off with Canada at the top, and then it says India, Australia, New Zealand, African colonies. So what the propaganda of this postcard was to say the glory of the empire, it's its colonies. And so it was really interesting how postcards were used in the war for other measures than just having a kind of a photographic record of the war itself. And so speaking of propaganda postcards, there's also some other ones that speak to a different settlement of the war. And this one is quite interesting because you see the relationships that's being formed as part of the Commonwealth. And this postcard says, "Sons of the Empire, Canada, India, and Australia," right? And so when we're speaking about the war, and if you look at Canada being on the left, India in the middle, and Australia on the right, I think it's important to kind of start giving some numerical context to the participation in the war. And the slide itself is just showing that close to 1.4 to 1.5 million soldiers were deployed to help the war as part of the Indian Expeditionary Force. And if we just look at the numbers of killed and wounded, if we just look at those participation levels that I talked about and compare them, that Canada and Australia combined will still not, in terms of amount of participation, of how much the British Indian Expeditionary Force was engaged. And so this also gives you a startling reminder that how, for a group of people who served in the war with these large numbers, and their stories have not been told, or we're not aware of these great stories, of these great numbers. In any other history, you would almost think it would be impossible not to share a story of 1.5 million people who served. It would be actually easier to share that story because the volume and the numbers. And I just shared with you a handful of postcards. I mentioned we have over 500 original postcards. We have a lot of original artifacts from the war, from medals to newspaper articles to photographs, a whole bunch of artifacts. So it's not like the information was not necessarily out there. The challenge really is who is writing history and who is actually being erased from history. And I think these numbers speak volumes. And on the next number of slides that I have, I'm not going to go through them in the number because I've asked Elizabeth to share with everybody that's participating today the next series of slides. But I do want you to know that it's great detail in terms of all the different combatants and non-combatants and the different theaters of war from Mesopotamia, Egypt, France, Persian Gulf, East Africa, Gallipoli, where predominantly these soldiers came from. 50% of them came from one province itself. And then, I was mentioning, because, we have the passenger list of the Komagata Maru, and it speaks to where their ancestral home was and where they're coming from. And when you look at the districts from Punjab districts, and it's juxtapositioned with the number of Komagata Maru passengers, and then the number of soldiers who fought in the war from the same villages, it really brings those early slides home of what was happening to us here in Canada at the same time we're participating in the war. And back to the postcards, this is a really interesting piece. And the slide deck that you're going to receive is going to have more slides, but I was just sharing some parts of that slide deck. This is a really interesting postcard. Both postcards are the same. It just, if you look at the one on the left, it says an Indian reverse for the Kaiser. Kaiser was another shorthand for German Kaiser Hind. And so when that postcard is turned upside down, on the one hand, on the left, you can see the reflection of the Sikh soldier, and on the right-hand side, you can actually see when the postcard's turned upside down, the imagery of the Kaiser. So I think it was an interesting, and again, we have these original postcards at the Sikh Heritage Museum. All the postcards that are shown as part of this exhibition are part of our collection that we have as well. Another one of our favorites, if we're speaking about whiskers and who won the war, I think we won both competitions, the Great Beard and Mustache Battle, as well as the war. So I think at the end of the day, the Germans were truly out-whiskered. And so, if we thought that the story of us on the Western Front was missing, now think about what I talked about the Komagata Maru, and we were disenfranchised in Canada in 1907. We lost franchise, and the war breaks out, and fellow Sikhs are turned away, and yet the Sikhs who are in Canada, within the racism that they were experiencing just in the country, let alone trying to sign up to participate in the war on behalf of Canada. The grave marker that you're looking at right now is of the very first Sikh soldier to enlist in Canada, in Montreal, in 1915. Private Gujjar Singh was also the first casualty out of the handful of Sikh soldiers that ended up finding a way to be able to serve for Canada. And I want you to pay some attention to the headstones, because it's going to be interesting, because I'm going to be sharing as you're mentioning, as part of the exhibit you have of war flowers and of the men who enlisted from Mississauga and didn't make it back. When we're looking at headstones too, first of all, I think a lot of people are going to be shocked, and I'll go back to the last slide, to even know that there was actually a specific Sikh script that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission had for Sikh headstones. But at the same time, some other pieces were missing, because if you actually look around where Gurjar Singh's headstone is, and it's buried in a military cemetery amongst 197 other Canadians, you can actually see the maple leaves on all the other headstones around him. And so for some reason, the maple leaf was not on here, and it was missing. And so it's one of the things that we're looking as a natural program that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission has as a rolling graves program, that if new information comes up, they'll update them as wear and tear gets on the graves. And so we're always looking at a number of these different facets, because you will see, as I'm going to be sharing the stories of some of the other soldiers that signed up and their headstones, you can see some of the disparities that they all have, some elements that are missing as part of their headstone. This one is actually not even a headstone. This was Private Lachman Lal Singh, who was killed in action in the war in October 1918 in a town near Belang in Belgium. And this is actually in the town square. So this is a war memorial that's actually in the town square of Belang. And on the next slide, you will actually see a close-up written in French there, where it says Soldats Canadiens, and it has listed two of the soldiers that had passed away, Jay Nadu and El Singh, for Lachman Singh. And so, you know, these are really interesting monuments related to Canadian Sikh history that we have in France. And so, you know, sometimes I know people have these great aspirations that they want to go and visit Paris and France and the Eiffel Tower. And I'm saying to my fellow Canadians, or even other fellow Sikhs that are watching, or other people that are just watching and engaging in this presentation, to know that there's so much rich history, and to explore beyond that we know, and to look out for these pieces. Go visit, you know, create a heritage trail and try to map out and find these great markers and identities. Because on the one hand, very clearly for this Canadian soldier, it says Soldats Canadiens. This is a Canadian soldier, right? And I know we're not wanted and we're needed, and beyond being needed, we're fulfilling our duty itself. And so it's important pieces to know. And in addition to this monument, Private Lachman Singh was originally first buried in Belang, and then in the 1930s, the body was reburied in a Arras cemetery in France. And the interesting piece around this one, I think most people will be asking, hey, where's the Sikh script on here? The Gurmukhi is missing. And there is the maple leaf, but there's a cross on here. Right? And I know sometimes if we look at the attestation papers, just to get some of the soldiers through, sometimes on the last page where there's only just a few options for selection of religion, sometimes they just, the person who is helping complete the attestation papers might have just even randomly themselves checked off Christian, right? And so it's interesting, because you can just see, as I mentioned, some of the differences. I'm just going to go back to Gurjar Singh's. It says the Gurmukhi script itself. It says Ikunkar Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh Sanskari Ge, and pretty much it is speaking to, in part, a Sikh affirmation and saying that pretty much that the body and the person has been read the rites and has moved on in faith. And so it's really interesting, because the last piece I'm going to show you, you know, the beauty when we're doing this work as a museum is that we have friends and partners right across the country who, when they're learning about some of this information, are trying to even then go further and deeper. And I'll encourage anybody who's watching the presentation to be inspired to even do more research, because we can find out more information. That this was actually a card that was sent to Private Bookham Singh to ask his family what they wanted on his headstone. And it was interesting because as part of the inscription, it says of Malpur, Punjab, it says clearly there no cross. And then it said Sat Sri Akal in English. And the current headstone does not have Sat Sri Akal in English. It didn't have a cross. It is missing the Gurmukhi script. And recently, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission was considering having the headstone be corrected to add what should have rightfully been there, the Sikh script, the Gurmukhi script, along with Sat Sri Akal. And so this is what that new headstone would look like for Private Bookham Singh's grave. We also had letters, and this is really interesting because the only reason that this letter probably still survives, and it doesn't survive in its original form, because it was probably written in Gurmukhi, but at that time the assumption was that any letter not written in English would have to first be censored, because we need to make sure we know what was being said and written about, and then it would be translated. So this is a translation of that letter. And you can see it says Sikh at the top. And right now, where this sits in the British archives, it's mislabeled as part of the British Indian. But you can clearly see on the top of the letter, even outside of the pieces that have been blackened out, it says from Private Singh, 38th Battalion, Canadian, right? And so just from those identifiers, and from Kapurthala, India, and then it says in brackets, Gurmukhi dated 23rd of November 1916. And I just want to read it because I think it speaks almost like any other soldier story we've heard. But the challenge is that I think none of our kids have ever been able to hear a letter from a soldier named Private Singh. And so I think it's a little bit important that I just want to spend a couple of minutes reading this letter. And it says, I should like to tell you about what happened on November 18th, but I'm not allowed to write. I can only give you some idea of what happened. On the 4th of November, there was a big fight, and much hand-to-hand fighting took place, and many prisoners were taken. The dead were countless. Shells and bullets were falling like rain, and one's body trembled to see what was going on. But when the order came to advance and take the enemy's trench, it was wonderful how we all forgot the danger and were filled with extraordinary resolution. We went over like men walking in a procession at a fair. And so this just, the Sikh soldiers, not only as part of the British Indian Army, even when they were representing Canada, you can just see how they're engaging in the war and shouting, we seized the trench and took the enemy prisoners. I didn't think of our safety at all, but I felt that the Guru Maharaj was fighting in me. He is great, and it is thanks to him that I was able to do all that I did. Pray to him whenever you pray, that he may deliver us all in such times of danger and bring us back to you again. Because the letter was written to a family member. When we took the trenches, some of the enemy escaped and some were taken. The dead were countless. The bravery which we showed that day was the admiration of the British soldiers. After the fight, they asked me how it was that I was so utterly regardless of danger. A beautiful letter from Private Singh, a great Canadian soldier, a great Canadian war hero. And it's these types of stories that I think need to be now presented. Long overdue, to say the least. Equally, a number of the soldiers that signed their attestation papers in Ontario signed them in Smith Falls. And a group of students, and Dr. David Gray is in the center of this picture with the camera around his neck, and students from Smith Falls District Collegiate Institute organized a campaign and raised some funds to help get the cenotaph that was in Smith Falls that has the names of a number of soldiers who signed up in Smith Falls. And you can see the gentleman right behind that little box there actually engraving on that cenotaph names of some of the Sikh soldiers. And through the work, David and the students in the Sikh Heritage Museum, you can see on the left-hand side that L. Singh, Lakshman Singh, as well as Warriam Singh, whose letter we just read, and Lachman Singh's, whose headstone and monument in the cenotaph of Town Square. Both of those soldiers now have a place on the cenotaph in Smith Falls, and this was only just done a couple of years ago. And so you can see that through the rediscovering of histories too, we're also now bringing and correcting, not only correcting, but putting in place our space where we should have been since the beginning itself. Equally, one of the most famous poems we have in Canada is in Flanders Field. And I shared the story that we were already in Flanders in 1915 before Canada even entered the war and the great poem was written. And again, I think it's important that when we think about Flanders, what kind of imagery do we have of the soldiers fighting in Flanders? And this particular piece is an article from the Graphic newspaper, and it's titled "The Indian in His Hours of Ease, an Evening Scene in a Flanders Village." Equally, Peace in the Midst of War is just another great article, and it says a church service near the fighting line in Flanders. And what's interesting is you can see the chaplain outside of the door, and at the top you can see the planes flying over and bombs and stuff going off, and there's this church service going on. And who's being asked to guard this church service? It's a Sikh soldier. And I think that's, again, poignant. And these stories have not necessarily been shared or are not part of our secular consciousness of the various ways that the Sikhs participated and supported the war efforts. And now probably to one of my favorite parts of the presentation, because I grew up in Malton, and it's interesting that one of the streets I actually lived on was Victory Crescent. And one of the schools I went to was called Lancaster. And as I started learning about the history and the names, this intersection right here of Churchill and Victory is quite significant. And both speak to the service of Sikhs in World War I and World War II. And so I'm just going to share some interesting narratives of Victory Crescent, which was named after the victory in the war, and individuals who had great influence in the war, like Churchill. And Lancaster was the Lancaster bomber. And the supreme commander of the Allied forces and the French general, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, was at a dedication ceremony for a monument that was going up to recognize the contributions of the British Indian soldiers, the Sikh soldiers. And as the dedication ceremony was going on, he looked across to the soldiers that were there present, and he said, "Return to your homes in the distant sun-bathed east and proclaim how your countrymen, drenched with their blood, the cold northern land of France and Flanders, how they delivered it by their ardent spirit from the firm grip of a determined enemy. Tell all India that we shall watch over their graves with the devotion due to all our dead. We should cherish above all the memory of their example. They showed us the way, they made the first steps to the final victory." How many times when we talk about victory and the war, has anybody said, who showed us the way? Who made the first steps to the final victory? So I think these pieces are important. Again, when we're talking about erasure, there was a recent Hollywood movie that came out about Winston Churchill and the darkest hour, and he was considered one of the great military minds. And it's unfortunate that the movie did not depict how he actually got started in his military career. This was a book that was published by Life magazine, and again, it's something we have at the museum. And we picked it up. In fact, one of my colleagues, Colin, had picked it up, and we're looking through it because we knew that he had a great connection and interest with the Sikh community. And his connection and interest was that he actually served with the Sikh regiment in 1897. And the image that you see here on the screen is also one of my favorite images in the book. And it shows action on the northwest frontier there in 1897. But this wasn't anywhere in the movie. And so you can see what erasure does. And it actually gives a false representation of history. Equally, and I think this is going to be a great story to share, the gentleman that you see here pictured is Pardeep Singh Nagra. And he was the very first Sikh pilot in World War I, and he actually fought on behalf of the British Indian Army. And for his autobiography, the foreword in the book, and again, it's something that we have at the museum, and I'll just share a couple of lines. It says, the foreword says, I consider it a privilege to write a foreword to the memoirs of an old and valued friend, H.S. Malik. My friendship with the author goes back long years. During World War I, we were both officers in the Royal Flying Corps, in which he served with such distinction. A few years later, we found ourselves as students together at Oxford. If I were to ask anybody to, in their wildest dreams, to guess who was his valued friend, fellow pilot, fellow Oxford grad, fellow athlete, it was none other than Lester B. Pearson. And if anybody knows my hometown of Malton State, as I call it, Toronto Pearson Airport is actually in Malton, Mississauga. And so, you know, little do we know that when we, as we're mentioning just in the preamble here today, just musing about, that these names that you see, we have schools named after Pearson, the kind of connections that we'll have. And what's another interesting story is both Pardeep Singh Nagra and Lester B. Pearson, both commanded by the most decorated World War I soldier, William Barker, right? And so these are interesting narratives that and war stories that have not just been shared. And can you imagine some young kids today learning in school that one of Lester B. Pearson's best friend was a handsome gentleman looking just so powerful, and it was a pilot, was an athlete, was a statesman, was a world-class cricketer and golfer, and was a Sikh. When we're speaking about Brothers in Arms, and why I chose this title, because another significant event in Canada, which we celebrate, is the Battle of Vimy. And we know that we have a great war memorial in Vimy. But again, a little story that many people are not aware of is that within the line of the Canadian soldiers in Vimy was the Lahore Division. And in partnership with Indus Media Foundation, we created a more inclusive and accurate imagery of Vimy Ridge, which included both Sikh and Canadian soldiers as brothers in arms in this great battle. I mentioned Indus Media Foundation, and there's a great person behind Indus Media Foundation on the West Coast named Stephen Purewal, and he actually published a phenomenal book that shares the tales of Punjabi and Sikh participation in the war, and it was actually a winner, chosen as the best books title for kids and teens, and not only for kids and teens, this is for adults alike. And I'll encourage everybody to take the title of Duty, Honor, and Izzat, and make sure that a copy of this book is in each of our households. It is so important as Canadians and other people outside of Canada who are tuned in, to make sure that we have a more accurate and inclusive history of the war efforts. And so I'll really encourage everybody to make sure that they do definitely have a copy. It's just phenomenally illustrated and researched, and it's an award-winning book written by a great Canadian author. I want to come back a little bit because we're talking about identity. And when I showed you that Loyal India piece and King George, I didn't show you the imagery of King George that was part of that call. And here he is, dressed in uniform, including the turban. The turban that was worn by the same passengers on the Komagata Maru. You know, I've always said, if it's fit for a Sikh, it must be fit for a king. And here he was. And why this is important is because I'm going to come back to how we started. And here is a picture of some passengers on the Komagata Maru. And I know it's a little bit blurry, but if you focus on right down the middle of this image to the gentleman in the back who's wearing a darker colored turban, that's because it's completely black on one side and it's lined on the, looking at the picture left side, on the right side of the turban. And that turban is identical to the one that King George is wearing, and he's a passenger. And so these British subjects that were on the ship were not just simply passengers, but they were individuals who were not only serving, but were defending the crown, and they were turned away. And so it's important to know that even with when the times were so difficult, that when the call came, that the Sikhs still fulfilled their duty. I just want to end with a really important piece, because as equally as I was sharing about World War I, it is the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And I'm just going to share a small 1-minute clip of a short heritage film called Promises that will be releasing in 2021 during Sikh Heritage Month. And it features a campaign in which Canadian Sikh soldiers fought as brothers in arms again in Europe. I've been sharing throughout this presentation that there's been huge erasure in history. Filmmakers such as Christopher Nolan and Dunkirk have continually erased the turban from depictions of campaigns that took place in Europe. And this short heritage film, Promises, seeks to provide a more accurate, inclusive representation of one of the hardest fought battles in Europe, the Battle of Monte Cassino. So I'm just going to ask you to just join me as we have an opportunity to engage in watching this little 1-minute presentation that Indus Media has put together for us.
Just checking. Pardeep, did you share the video? We're still seeing the PowerPoint right now.
Okay, you're still seeing the PowerPoint? Is the video on now?
Oh, there's the video, yeah.
Perfect. And thank you for confirming. And so just to let everybody know that we're watching just a small piece from Promises. This is raw footage, literally, because these scenes were just being shot in the last couple of weeks itself, but Indus was kind enough to be able to provide this short for us as part of this presentation. And we're going to have the honor and privilege to be hosting some of the screenings here next year. Hopefully the pandemic will be over and we'll be able to see it in theaters. If not, then we'll do some online hosting for the release of Promises. And so this wraps up the formal part of the presentation. And I just want to say merci, thank you, miigwech, and thank you for giving me the opportunity. And I hope that just being with us here today I've been able to share something new with you, something different with you, something inspiring with you that you can now take as community historians and to be able to share it further. So thank you very much for the time, and thank you for participating.
My goodness, Pardeep, thank you so much for your generosity and for sharing all this profound knowledge and history tonight. And just looking through the comments, it's very clear that our audience is so appreciative as well. And we have one person who, this is a fantastic comment I'll share. Hopefully this results in a strong call to action to be all that they can be, to not only proudly represent their ancestors, but to continue to seek the truth about where they come from. And you've been doing this work, Pardeep, and you've been part of an incredible community, as you mentioned, Stephen Purewell and Indus, who are also doing this work to ensure that these stories are included and represented in the telling of Canada's history. So kudos, thank you so much.
Sure. And you know, I just want to say for you know, the parents, I hope you now have more resources to share with your own children. For any of the young kids that have been watching, I hope you're going to be inspired so that and this is not just stories for Remembrance Day. These are stories that we should be able to share anytime. And you know, you might also become a collector. You might want to collect postcards. In fact, you might want to collect some toy soldiers. Here's a nice little cavalry toy soldier that I have, similar to what we've been sharing of those images of King George and one of the passengers themselves. And if it's not that, it might be a great Lego piece that you want to create as a little Sikh cavalry character. It could be stamps, it could be newspapers, it can be letters. But I just hope at the end of the day that you know, there's some spark and I can inspire others to take these stories further and deeper and share them widely. That's why we want to make all the material we have available. Indus has always been kind to us. That the reason why we put the time and effort in is for this material to be out there. And so we don't want to own it. We want to push it out. And like I said, we'll be sharing some of the slide deck, not with individuals, and hopefully you'll pick up copies of the book.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we did get a few, well, we got a lot of questions and we're past 8 o'clock, but I think we'd like to try to get to some of these questions for you, Pardeep. So for those who can stay, please stay. And for those who do have to run tonight, thank you for joining us. We are recording this talk and it will be presented on the Museums of Mississauga's website later on. So we'll be sharing that link out with Pardeep's other slide decks. So let's dive into some of these questions. There's, just to pick up what you were talking about inclusion and sharing the histories with our families, with children, with students. We are asking, how do we teach the histories of Sikh soldiers in war without buying into an imperial/colonial narrative? Is there a way to be critical of imperialism while also honoring these histories and stories?
For sure. In fact, I think one of the best strategies, and I was thinking about speaking to it, and it's great that the question popped up on it, because really, if I were to do this presentation, there's another lens that I can easily use. But the reason why I had to write in British subjects, because I was putting in the context of the language that was used and that we're colonized at this moment, and that's why that language was specifically written, and it put that context of what our reality was. But if you're talking about just specifically the Sikh soldiers, we're sovereign. We always have been, and we always will be. And I think the most critical, simplest way to tell our sovereign story of our participation in the war is just to look at the simple name that every single Sikh soldier to the last used in the war, and that was Singh. So they never used their family name, their village name. We know, for example, Bukam Singh was a Bains, but Bukam Singh, Waryam Singh, Lakshman Singh, right? The thousands, the 100,000s that served as sovereign, so that when the last piece that they did to enter the war was to sign their name, and they signed it as a sovereign people. And so make no mistake that regardless of how even people in the community are thinking that we were never were slaves to the British. We never have been, we never can be, and never will be, because we've always been a sovereign people, a sovereign community. In fact, look how sovereign we were, in addition to the name Singh, that we wore just our turbans in the war. And so when you look at these critical identifiers, it tells you that we knew who we were in this war. And we knew that we're fulfilling a duty for civilization in the Great War. And we were not there as slaves to anybody, but under our own free will. And we're going to act in accordance to that free will. We did it in Canada. We're disenfranchised, but we still signed up. right? We're being colonized, but we're still serving. But we reminded people that we're going to serve as a sovereign people with our identity intact with the turban and going under a sovereign name of Singh, lion, the lions of the Great War. So we always say that the story has been told by the hunter, the lion story. And so it's about time that if you want to create a nice story of Sikhs and their participation, just talk about the lions of the Great War, and you'll be speaking of the Sikhs, the sovereign people who served in the war. So absolutely, I understand that. I know sometimes people have challenges. I've never had a problem separating that piece because I know I know the nuances for how in which we serve, and we served with such distinction and such valor. But thanks for the question because it's important to know.
Absolutely. Thank you. We have another question. It's sort of amusing that maybe that you could speak to a little bit. Wonder why colonized groups / soldiers are not acknowledged even on Remembrance Day. It's as if they weren't a part of the social fabric in 1914. So still to this day.
And absolutely, and this was just Remembrance Day. I can easily do a presentation with you because remember, that was 1914. I talked about the Sikh community actually had already built a Gurdwara in Canada in 1908. We're already an established pioneer community here in Canada. But yet, even if we use the word pioneers or talk about early Canadian pioneers, that's not the first image that comes up or has never come up. It's not the default image. Again, if I were to ask a young child to draw a picture of a soldier, would they draw a picture of somebody with a turban? They probably can't if they didn't even know they actually served in the war. Because first of all, you need to know who served. Mm-hmm. Second of all, headstones. You know, if we continually only depict headstones with crosses on them and not the Star of David or the Crescent Moon or the Gurmukhi script that we now have access to, because I presented those and some of these pieces are on our website. We now have the tools and resources and there's no excuses, and we have a right as parents to ask our teachers to even encourage our kids to go to school with these materials, to share these materials. And so that's been why part of our journey as a museum, our first and foremost part of our journey was that we're collectors, because we felt that artifacts related to our history should be in our hands and accessible to us whenever. And also then the next part is we need to be our storytellers. And so it's combining those pieces, and that's what I hope that people will be encouraged and become historians, become passionate to continue to want to learn. Get the book, Do We Honor Is It? I mean, I can't get the book Undesirables. There's so many great, Becoming Pioneers, Sikh Pioneers in Their Own Words, Becoming Canadians by Sarji Jagpal. You know, I know there's also a Sikh Heritage Museum in Abbotsford. You know, visit that as well. They're doing some great work out there as well. We have things at our fingertips, and we have access to resources and books that can be delivered to our house on the same day. So there's no excuses anymore. And let's not think from a deficit mindset. Let's look at the presentation that I just provided today, and we should be in awe and wonder and just excited that the minute we get off this presentation that we're going to just be flaunting and talking to everybody about what we saw and sharing and, you know, linking into our Facebook page, because, you know, next year we're going to be doing a lot more things online. So, no, definitely pieces are out there now. And like I said, I had my information out in the front, Pardeep at shmc.ca. So, you know, you can find me, contact, and I can share even more resources, more videos. And so absolutely. Yeah, it's a tipping point. You know, it's a tipping point for us now. And it's not just the racialized groups like the Sikhs, the Indigenous community, the Asian community, the Black community that served for Canada as well, and various theaters of war as well.
Thank you. We are getting just some really amazing questions here. Oh gosh, but maybe to pick up on that again, we had a question about the medals that Sikh soldiers received. Were they the same as the same medals in the Indian Army? Were they the same as the ones in the British Army? And maybe you can tie in what's at the Bradley Museum for people to see these
For
pieces.
sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. So the medals that were received, and in fact, some of the Sikh soldiers received some unique medals, like the Mon Star, because there was a special one that was commemorating the ones who were actually in the war in 1914. Because remember, it started in August, so it was about 4 months. And so, yeah, we have medals. They're identical medals to Sikh soldiers, and we have medals to granthis, we have medals to drummers, we have medals to stretcher bearers, we have medals to buglers, we have medals to cavalry. I mean, you name a regiment, you name a role that they played in the war, and we have lots of materials, including medals and stuff. And yeah, no, absolutely. The World War I medal is usually distinguished by its ribbon bar, which is almost like a rainbow shape itself, and inscriptions and stuff, and on the back says for the Great War of Civilization. But yeah, so the medals were identical. The medals were identical, and in fact, there's a gentleman in the community that actually has the medal that was awarded to Bukam Singh, Private Bukam Singh. And an interesting story when you talk about medals, because there was one of our board members, Gurmeet Singh, who was also a military historian. On one of his military groups, there was somebody that was sharing this story, that's saying they were a jeweler, and just a bag full of medals were brought over, and they wanted to just erase the names on the medals, so that if somebody's looking for a medal that's missing from their family collection, they can maybe get an original war medal, and the name's gone erased out, so it just looks like a blank one, but it's still original. But the problem is when you erase the names, you're erasing history forever. And one of the medals, because the gentleman that posted some of the names, actually L. Singh, Lachman Singh's medal, got erased.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, I'm almost getting teared up.
Yeah, it's just the
Yeah.
erasure, the ongoing
Yeah.
erasure. So,
Yeah. Yeah, and there's only a handful of Canadians that served, Sikh Canadians Canadian Sikhs in Canada that served, and that medal getting erased was just even more significant, just because of what it represented.
absolutely. Well, and I believe that the question was posed by Gurmeet as well. So now we are showing the 1914 medal that shows that the men who served between August and November in 1914, and I believe that was one that he had lent.
Yeah. Gurmeet had lent it to us. Yeah, absolutely. And because that's also on the ribbon bar too. It's signified with the leaf as well. So that's how that soldier's DNA, you can kind of find out which battles and when and stuff by looking at the ribbon bar and stuff. So yeah, absolutely.
Amazing. Would you like one more question, and then we'll wrap it up for this evening?
Oh, I can like 10 more questions, but anyway, it's I'm here as long as you need me.
I know, I'm sorry. Okay, this is, we'll ask this question. Would you say that Sikhs served Canada with honor and Canada used Sikhs for convenience? Were Sikhs considered with respect as veterans? I think were Sikhs considered with respect as veterans.
Yeah, and it's interesting if we look at what that means. First of all, how many people knew for the last 25 years when there were many soldiers in Canada and in the Commonwealth from diverse communities that migrated across the Commonwealth and were attending ceremonies or Legion halls, that these were people who served as brothers in arms, and yet they were not allowed into a Legion hall in Canada with a turban on. And even to this day, the only time that you can be seen as at minimum equal, and I'm saying in some respects, I've said we were in the war before people look like we were in the war before Canada entered the war. And so I think there needs to be that acknowledgement, that gratitude, that honor that Sikh soldiers deserve. And it is necessary to be able to know that the role they played, and in fact, literally, when you see a Sikh veteran with a turban, it should be an honor to have them present amongst our company anywhere in Canada.
Absolutely. Thank you. It has been an honor to work with you these last few months. I love your style. Let's do it, and it happens. And it's been an honor to be here with you tonight and learn so much. And as everyone is saying in the chat, I think you've just blown some minds tonight. People are saying this is like the knowledge it's insane. We're Googling everything right now and just so inspired, looking up all these details. So there is so much more information out there. This is a fantastic starting place. It is the Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada that Pardeep is the executive director of, and you can book appointments to visit the exhibitions through their website. And the artifacts that Pardeep has so graciously lent to the Museums of Mississauga are on display at the Bradley Museum, and you can book an appointment to visit the Bradley as well. We will be sharing this recording on our website, as I mentioned, and that slide deck that Pardeep has created for us, I'll share as well. And as he mentioned, you can connect with him at Pardeep at shmc.ca.
Great. Yeah, and we're just also going to be changing our website up a little bit too. So in the transition, if you're emailing at our info address, maybe better yet, just the number's on there, and it's a direct number to me, and you can just contact me as well if you don't hear from me. If you're looking for something, absolutely. And thank you very much for the opportunity and for hosting the Sikh Heritage Museum. Thank you to all the participants and friends and colleagues that I've known have joined. Thank you for your support. It's always appreciated.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Well, everyone, we are going to conclude the presentation here. We will be taken to a short survey. We would be grateful for any feedback or thoughts you have to share with the Museums of Mississauga. For more information about the exhibitions on display right now, please do visit us at mississaugaculture.ca/warflowers. It's been such a pleasure to be here with you all tonight. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Take care. Thank you.